I think even when women or people of color do write books about topics that are not specific to women or people of color, I think that it's seen often as kind of a supplement to the real theological canon, as opposed to like core of like what a seminarian should learn or what people in general should learn.
This is Down to Earth Conversations, where we hear from ordinary people who are helping to bring a bit of heaven down to earth. Kia ora. Welcome to another episode of Down to Earth Conversations with me, your host, Andy Dixon. I've been talking to a whole lot of great people over the last week, and I can't wait to bring you those conversations. A little heads up about something newish. I've seen a number of my guests go on to do inspiring and encouraging things that I think you would love to hear about. And so I've started having little 15 to 20 minute catch-ups with former guests about some of what they've been up to since our kōrero. I've recorded the first of those and I've got others teed up. So super excited to start bringing those to you as and when I connect with people. The first is with episode 10 guest Te Karere Whitiao Scarborough, and it's pure gold. So keep an eye out or an ear out for that coming very soon. Today I have the privilege of bringing you my conversation with Cooledge Jenkins. Liz and I follow each other on Instagram, although neither of us remember how that connection came about. But she let me know about this book that she's got coming out in December, and I immediately knew that I had to get her on the podcast. The book is called Nice Churchy Patriarchy, and it's a combination of Liz's experiences in and even working for various American evangelical churches, and her deep thinking and research around attitudes and impacts of patriarchy, even in those spaces that claim to see everyone as equals. We discuss Liz's experience as a woman in church spaces, what she's learnt from that. We talk about how her exploration of patriarchy goes hand in hand with her growing understanding of the many other minority groups within the Western Church and the way that the Church has treated them. And we talk about how it's actually people's ability to live into the fullness of their humanity that's at stake. This is episode 79 of Down to Earth Conversations. Here's Liz Cooledge Jenkins. Liz Cooledge Jenkins, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
And for those who haven't heard of you, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, totally. My name is Liz. I'm a writer. I live in the Seattle area in Washington State with my husband and our black cat that we adopted as kind of a neighborhood stray. And I am very much just kind of a human on a journey of trying to figure out how do we make this world better and more just, and what does that have to do with faith and spirituality, and how do we make churches better and more just. So it's been a bit of a journey through kind of working in college campus ministry for a while and going to seminary for a while after that, and then after I graduated about 4 years ago, kind of trying to figure out what it looks like to be a writer and to kind of think through some of these things and hopefully help other people think about some of these things in some way.
Awesome. And regular listeners will already know why you're on the podcast after that explanation. Because, the whole justice thing, looking at how can we make the world better? How can we make our churches places that make the world better? All of that is what we're totally about on this podcast. So great to have you here. Like you say, you're a writer. You've got blog posts, articles all over the internet in a whole bunch of different places. And now, of course, you've got an upcoming book, which is going to get released later in the year, which I've had the pleasure of reading and is fantastic. How did you get into writing?
Yeah, writing is something that I've always done just for myself, kind of as a way of processing things. I think that through most of my time in seminary, I kind of assumed that I would be applying for PhD programs afterwards, whether that was in Christian ethics or church history or something along those lines. And I think, the idea of being able to teach appealed to me, and the idea of being able to spend a ton of time just researching and learning and writing appealed to me. But I think as my time in seminary went on, I kind of realized that Not always, but often in the academic world, you're very much just kind of within the academic world and speaking to other people who are in that world and using these particular kind of jargons and language that aren't very accessible to just normal, thoughtful people who are not in academia. So I think I came out of seminary really wanting to focus on kind of what could I write that would mean something to people beyond the academy and to people who are really wrestling with some deep, important questions about spirituality and justice and all that.
Yeah. Funny, that's like a real similar journey to myself in terms
Okay.
of doing the study. So I did Masters of Theology program,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
then was weighing up whether to carry on into PhD or not, getting encouragement to do that, but just really feeling like, there was a whole lot of stuff that I'd been learning at college that I shouldn't have had to go to college to learn. That
Totally.
that should have been stuff that the church was teaching, and thought, well, actually, I just want to get back out into, I don't know if the
Yeah.
real world's the right phrase, but out into normal life, and share some of this back with the people. So yeah, that's what I'm passionate about as well, and great to hear that that's on your heart. And I've read some of your articles and things, and you write about a whole bunch of different things, from climate change, abortion, abuse of volunteers in churches, patriarchy, a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah.
Is there something that underlies all of that for you, or do you just kind of bounce around topics that are interesting to you, or is there something kind of deeper that's tying it all together?
Sure. I mean, certainly sometimes it feels like bouncing around. But I do think that I mean, so when I was first thinking about applying for seminary, I felt kind of a specific sense of calling, and I don't want to use that lightly. And I think that could mean lots of different things to different people. But I think I felt a sense of invitation to help the church, was kind of the phrase that came to my mind. It's very broad, lots of different forms that can take. But I think that even now, probably what, 7 years after that, I feel like that's still kind of a guiding principle of there are people who go to church or who have some kind of Christian background or tradition that they still value, even if they're not going to church. And how do we all kind of help each other think about things more deeply? And I think, I started seminary around the same time that Trump got elected president of the US. And I think that was kind of a turning point for me in terms of like, oh, like, how did we get here as a church where 81% of white evangelicals voted for this person that does not represent anything that I want Christianity to represent? And so I think there's kind of there's kind of some underlying questions of like, how did we get here and how do we do something different as church, as Christians?
I love that you're writing about all these different topics, but you are writing about them from the perspective of, hey, church, how can we do better?
Hmm.
It's You're not pointing
Hmm.
fingers, um, you're not standing on one side throwing rocks across. You're going, hey, I'm part of this too, but also you're going, hey, do you know there's some other ways to think about this? Have
Yeah,
There's actually some people that think about this in a way that's different from what I grew up with.
totally. And I think in some evangelical environments, you're not really encouraged to realize that there are different ways of being Christian. You're kind of encouraged to consider maybe more progressive or mainline denominations as not legitimately Christian. And so I think that takes some unpacking too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in my upbringing, no one ever said it, but you just kind of got the sense of, well, we've figured out the right way to be Christian, and everyone else
Right.
will eventually fall in line. You
Right.
know, um,
Right.
and then you get out into the big wide world and meet friends and realize that actually that's incredibly arrogant. you know,
Totally.
um, and
Yeah.
going, how would I think? How could I think that I've got it all sorted when Christians have been wrestling with stuff for 2,000 years, and the
Right.
Jews for thousands of years before that? So
Right.
yeah,
And have
but
come to very different conclusions over that time and in different places and contexts. Yeah.
yeah, and that's something I love. Like reading your book is you actually delved into that and went, hey, some of the things I got taught were pitched as this is what Christians have always thought, aren't what Christians have always thought.
Right.
Some Christians might have, but actually there is a whole range of ways that Christians have thought over the years, and we change our minds about so many things.
Right.
So your book, Nice Churchy Patriarchy, which I've just read and I thought was brilliant. And I said before we started recording that part of me, was absolutely loving it, and part of me was in anguish that you had to even bother writing it.
Right,
Um,
yeah.
but why, out of all the things you could have chosen to write about, why did patriarchy become the one that you're like, I need to focus on this for a book?
Yeah, I mean, it was my life, right? For most of my 20s. And I think I wanted to write something that was driven by story, that was kind of memoir-ish, where, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different source material and a lot of things I learned in seminary and have learned from other writers and theologians. But I think kind of the main driving force of it is kind of everything that I experienced and how I reflect on it now. So I think, yeah, I mean, I had, many more stories than could fit in a book. I had to kind of pare it
Yeah,
down and try to
yeah,
focus. And yes, it just felt like the right place to start. Yeah.
yeah. And I think that's what makes it really readable as well. It makes it something that uh, anybody in a church can pick up and find themselves somewhere in that, because you are sharing personally, but you're sharing in a way that, you're not putting anyone down. You're just going, why was it like this?
Right. That's the intent.
What
Yeah.
happened
Thank you.
here? And
Mhm.
which, yeah, I mean, I think I messaged you halfway through and was just like, oh my goodness, this is bringing up so many memories, and I'm a man, like
Yeah.
I can't
Right.
imagine having been a woman and experienced all of that. So
Mhm.
I think you definitely get your point across. Before we carry on too much, what for those who kind of aren't entirely sure what we're talking about, what do you mean by patriarchy, and how is that connected to the church?
Yeah, I would say patriarchy in general is kind of any structure or system where men have more power than women do. So any kind of system of male dominance or control. So in church context, that includes kind of male-dominated leadership, male-dominated preaching, often kind of certain gender roles and expectations within marriage or relationships. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of when I talk about patriarchy.
Obviously, that's a societal thing, but some of that societal thing has been reinforced by the church, and I think that comes through quite clearly
Right.
in the book as well. Um, and like you said, this is coming from your own story, so this is actually quite personal to you. And you say in the book, I'm no longer willing to be patronized in this way. I'm no longer interested in calls for unity at the cost of full acknowledgement of my humanity. Um, what are some of the sorts of things, and especially I guess the more subtle things? We can all see the really obvious "I'm in charge, you'll do what I say" woman
Right.
kind of things. But what are the more subtle things that you have experienced that might go unnoticed, that you've experienced in churches, that have undermined that ability for you to kind of live into the fullness of your humanity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think, and as you mentioned before, some things that might seem like they shouldn't be subtle, you might not notice. Like when I first started attending the church that I went to in my 20s, I think it took me at least a year or two before I realized that I wasn't just seeing male preachers every week because that's how it happened to be right now. I was seeing male preachers every week because that's how it was designed intentionally.
Because that wasn't your
I
experience growing up, was it?
Right, yeah, 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 and at my home church, we had a male senior pastor, but there were 2 other women, pastors who preached as often as any other associate pastor did, and, nobody really seemed to think twice about it, so I didn't really think to ask a lot of questions when I moved away for college and found a new church, and yeah, but yeah, I mean, as far as some of the more subtle things, yeah, there's so many of them, and I think that's what I kind of wanted to focus on with the book, because I think they're things that kind of can seem okay, or they're kind of easy to write off. And I really want to kind of, for myself and for other women, take these things seriously. So, yeah, I mean, I think just as one example, I think I've really had to struggle and wrestle with my sense of myself as a preacher over time. And I think that's something I embrace comfortably now, but it's been a really long road to get there. For instance, at the church that I worked at in my 20s, about 2 years into my time working there, the church hired another colleague to work with me in college ministry. And he had just graduated from college. Great person, nothing but respect for him. But he was a lot younger than me and a lot less experienced. And I found out about 2 months into his time working for the church that he'd been invited to preach at the church Thanksgiving service. And I was like, oh, okay. At first, I was kind of like, yeah, that's a great opportunity for him. And then I was like, wait a minute, how come no one ever invited me to do anything like that? And I've been through the church's ministry training program, and that included Bible classes as well as some preaching classes and practice preaching in front of your classmates. And so I felt like I had some experience and some positive feedback from that, but had never really been invited to use it in like a whole church preaching kind of way. And I asked my supervisor about this because it was kind of bothering me. And he was like, oh, well, this person expressed interest in preaching. I don't really feel like I've heard you express that same kind of interest. And he wasn't wrong. Like, that was true. I hadn't expressed that same kind of interest. But I think there's all sorts of kind of subtle gendered things that played into that in terms of what is expected of women and what sorts of ambition is rewarded or not, and what comes across as the confidence to ask to preach versus kind of arrogance or something negative. And how are you even supposed to know if you have preaching gifts or want to preach when all the preachers that you see are men every week? So I think that was kind of one of those more subtle things that like I had to kind of think about over a few months or a few years of like why did that happen that way? And yeah, just kind of some of the reasons it took me so long to kind of develop that confidence to be like, yeah, I think I'm supposed to be preaching.
One of the ones I really appreciated you highlighting in the book was the fact that, particularly in the area of church and theology, if I, as a white male, was to go, hey, I want to write a book, I could pretty much choose just about any topic I wanted, and
Right.
it would be acceptable. But when we look at the women's books or the people of colour's books that are getting published in that space, a lot of them are, books like yours that are really important, where you're writing about women in the church and patriarchy and that kind of thing, and people of colour are writing about, the experience of people of colour in the church and
Mm-hmm.
racism and those kind of things, which are all really
Right.
important. But it's
Mm-hmm.
like if they tried to write something else, it would almost be seen as a step outside of their realm that they should be focusing on. Whereas,
Yeah.
again, for me as a white male, there isn't kind of a realm that I should be focusing on, so I'm kind of free to roam. And I'd never really thought
Right.
about that. But as I went back and looked at a whole bunch of the people that I follow and the authors that I have connected with, I went, oh wow, that's actually playing out over and over again. And I mean, there's obviously exceptions to that, but
Mm-hmm.
as a general rule, I found that fascinating. Like, was that something that you suddenly just became aware of, or like how did you notice that, or was it just your experience of going, actually, I want to write, and this kind of seems to be the only thing I'm allowed to write about?
I don't think it was the latter. That's interesting though. Yeah, I think it was largely through that experience of kind of being like, okay, I'm aware at some level. This is an experience I write about in the book of how white male skewed a lot of my books are from seminary and just from my time in church before that. But I want to know like exactly precisely what that actually looks like. So I kind of made this spreadsheet of all of the books that I had and categorized them by the author's racial and gender identity. And yeah, so I think it came out as I was kind of examining that and doing some math and playing with some numbers there and trying to better understand like what is the landscape of these authors that I've been learning from and the theologians that were kind of centered in my seminary education. So yeah, I'd say it came through that, just kind of putting that in a spreadsheet and just kind of putting some numbers to it. Yeah, and I would say that I mean I think even when women or people of color do write books about topics that are not specific to women or people of color, I think that it's seen often as kind of like a supplement to like the real like theological canon, as
Yeah,
opposed to like kind of the core of like what a seminarian should learn or what people in general should learn. So that's an issue too.
yeah, yeah. That came up when I interviewed Jared Bias on the podcast, and at the Bible for Normal People that he's a part
Oh
of,
yeah.
they have that phrase of all theology has an adjective, meaning that
Yes.
that
Yes.
you kind of get this idea that there's feminist theology and disability theology and womanist theology, and then you've just got normal theology.
Right.
Whereas actually normal theology in a lot of spaces is actually probably better labelled as, white male theology. And it's not that
Absolutely.
that's a negative thing, it's just that that's an honest thing.
Yeah, everyone has a social location. We need to be aware of that, yeah.
And that kind of highlights, I guess, your whole point there, that, you've got this kind of level of normal, and then you've got all these bits around the side that are kind of, they're there, but they're not as important. Which, again, that leads to that subtlety of nobody's actually coming out and saying, hey, you lot aren't important. In fact, people are going, hey, you guys are really important
Mhm, mhm.
at doing what you're doing, and
Right.
leave us to keep doing that. Which, yeah, I think the more I read your book, the more I realised there are a whole bunch of, I mean, I've thought about this a lot, because I came out of a very patriarchal church system into a space that was the opposite of that, and really flourished in that space, and really loved seeing women flourish in that space. And so, I've wrestled with that over the years theologically, because I knew all of the reasons why it was like it was growing up. But yeah, I think even having thought about it a lot, it was the things you highlighted in the book that were much more subtle. That kind of, I mean, you're talking about churches that have decided that actually, no, we're all equal. Men and women can preach. Women can be leaders. All of that stuff. And I'd kind of gone, great, job done. And yet you're highlighting, no, even within those places, there is stuff going on here that is based on our patriarchal systems. Do you want to just share a little bit about those kind of spaces, and what you see in those kind of spaces?
Yeah, yeah, so the book kinda journeys through, like, my 20s and more of a complementarian, more explicitly patriarchal church space into a seminary that I chose because it's egalitarian, among other reasons, and a church that I went to at the time that was also explicitly egalitarian. So I think, yeah, that was it was kind of surreal part of the journey of being at first just so excited to be in these spaces where women were not prevented from preaching or being professors in a seminary context or anything like that. And the seminary I went to had welcomed women into its programs fully since I think the 70s or something like that. So it wasn't new. And yet, I think it took me a while to kind of become aware that just because these environments said they were, and really, I think honestly wanted to be supportive of women in ministry, didn't mean that they're there yet. Yeah, I think it's a first step. And I hear this from queer folks too, in terms of LGBTQ inclusion in churches. That's the first step, saying we're affirming this is good. But then actually getting to a place where everyone operates as equals and you don't have this kind of heteronormative environment everywhere is a different story. So I think it's the same thing with patriarchy. These institutions have often, whether they're denominations or seminaries, they've often been established with male leadership as the norm and male leadership in mind. And I think that that is a hard ship to turn. Yeah, so I mean, I think in seminary that took the form of, I would say professorship was still male dominated. I would say the stuff that we read in class was very dominated by male authors. And the figures that we learned about in church history, with the exception of my women in church history class that I specifically took, were also very male dominated. And I mean, I remember pretty early on kind of looking through a book that had excerpts and reflections from different historical theologians. And I think we got to choose a couple to read each day or something like that. And I'm kind of there like looking for the female names because that's who I want to learn from and finding them very few and far between. I think I read about the martyrdom of Perpetua from the very early church, and beyond that, there wasn't much. So yeah, things like that of like, how am I supposed to see myself as a woman in church if I don't see myself in the curriculum or in the history? Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that last point you raised goes to why this is important, because we're not just talking about it would be nice if churches weren't patriarchal, or, this is actually having a real effect on people,
Mhm.
particularly on women, but also, as you point out in the book, it stems out to other marginalised groups as well. or other minority groups.
Mhm.
But also, just as part of my journey, I realised how impoverished the church was for keeping, 50% of its people at arm's length,
Right.
and started
Right.
asking myself the question, why would we do that? And yeah, so this has had a real effect on you through the years. What are some of the ways that it's actually personally affected you, rather than just you thinking about, hey,
Yep.
I'm noticing this. What are some times where you're like, no, actually, this is really impacting me? So, sorry, you've got like a
Yeah,
million
that's a good
stories you've got to
question.
choose from. Uh, sorry.
I know where to start. Where to start. Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think I kind of touched on this with talking about preaching a little bit, but I think that what I was kind of trying to get at there, it's not about preaching, right? Like, not everyone's meant to be a preacher. Everyone has different gifts. I think it's about confidence, and being able to have kind of the whole array of opportunities open and available, and not limited because of gendered expectations or norms or explicit rules. Yeah, so I think just kind of developing, I mean, I think people in their teens and 20s especially are often kind of very much in that stage of like developing a sense of who I am as a person and what I'm supposed to be doing in this world and what my gifts are and interests. And so I think when that's kind of limited in any way, that kind of limits the ways that you're able to develop as a person. So yeah, I mean, I think that I've like personally come to the conclusion over time that I'm not trying to pursue pastoral ministry. But I'm also very aware that if I were, there were just a million more roadblocks to that path,
Mm,
than there would have been if I were a
yeah,
man. Yeah.
yeah, and I think like reading the book, you get also that sense of just the messages that come through, like you're actually not that important, or you're not as valuable as these
Hmm.
people.
Hmm.
Um, which, I mean, it doesn't matter if you
Hmm.
want to work in the church or not. If that's the message you're hearing, that
Right.
actually you're not that
Right.
valuable. And on the other hand, they're saying, you're created in the
Yeah.
image of God, and you know, you can do all things, and well,
Right.
not those things, because you're not quite valuable enough for
Right.
that. That
Right.
that must have some impact on people hearing that kind of subtly over and over again.
Totally. Yeah. And as you said, I mean, when the whole church isn't hearing from women in the pulpit, the whole church misses out. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the, I guess it comes through in your title of your book, the nice churchy patriarchy. One of the things you stress in the book is that actually the environments you have been in haven't been horrible. They're not
Hmm.
full
Hmm.
of a whole lot of
Yeah.
power hungry, evil guys trying to control everything.
Right.
They're nice people who are trying to do their best to honour God. Um,
Hmm.
and actually, there's a lot to appreciate about those environments for you. But you
Hmm.
talk about how that niceness covers up a whole lot of more insidious things, more damaging theologies,
Yeah.
mindsets, practices, a whole bunch of stuff. Can you just share a little bit about that for us?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, yeah, I do feel fortunate kind of to, by some combination of luck and choice to have not ended up in the worst of patriarchal communities. And I think about this as we see some of the documentaries that have come out in the last year or so, about different megachurches and um, different, very explicitly patriarchal systems. I mean, I was never involved in anything like IBLP or the Gothards things. And yeah, so it's a very different kind of environment that I spent my 20s in. But I think that's why it's worth talking
Yeah.
about these kind of subtler things. And yeah, I think that because people are and were so nice and wonderful in so many ways, it made it hard to speak up about things that weren't working or that were unjust or that needed to change. I think there's sometimes kind of a little bit of gaslighting that can happen there of like, oh, maybe that wasn't about gender or maybe that wasn't really that bad. And so I think it took me several years to kind of be like, no, those things were that bad. Yeah, even though people were kind, well intentioned, generous in so many ways, there were also kind of, yeah, like you said, these undercurrents of patriarchy that really do a lot of damage to women and girls and to everyone. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, the church was just wonderful in so many ways, right? So I think I even feel the tension now of like talking about these things and not wanting to like make them out as villains or anything like that. But I think the theologies, the systems, the thought processes, those all need to be talked about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, how do we do that? How do we start
Um,
to address this within our churches? Even our very
yeah,
egalitarian churches, how do we bring out this idea of the sort of insidious underneath theologies that sit there?
I mean, I think one angle is just making sure that we center the voices and experiences and perspectives of people who are most impacted by whatever issues we're trying to sort through, right? Like, there should not be, as there were at my former church, conversations about women in ministry and whether or not they wanted to change any of their views. Like, there should not be those conversations without women being in positions to make those decisions, right? There should not be an all male board making that decision. So, yeah, things like centering the voices of people who are most impacted. I also talk a bit in the book about just kind of how do we be a little more clear, direct, and honest in the language that we use to talk about these things. I think that, I mean, soft complementarianism is a term that sounds kind of nice and warm and fuzzy, and like it's a lot better than those hard complementarian churches over there that are really doing some damage to women. But it's not warm and fuzzy. It's still patriarchy. It's still church endorsed explicit patriarchy. It's still not okay. I also talk a bit about kind of the language of like people debating like whether women can or can't be pastors or leaders or elders, and how that kind of covers up a multitude of things that might be behind that can or can't. Because we know that women can preach, women can lead, women are doing those things in lots of contexts. So yeah, kind of sorting through like what is hiding behind some of those kind of nice sounding words, and by saying that women can't preach, does somebody mean that they don't see justification for it in scripture? In which case, let's talk about that, right? Or kind of whatever the reason might be. Because can and can't is just kind of an expression of power, right? Like I say that you can or can't do this. Yeah, so kind of clearing up some of the language. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny, even I was thinking of churches that I've been involved in where we say things like, we let women preach here.
Yes.
And it's like, hang on, who's the we? And
Right.
and what
Right.
authority do we have to think that we could not let women? Like
Right.
it's
Right.
just astounds me that so much of that patriarchal stuff seeps into even those spaces where we think we're doing really well. And we touched on
Yeah.
that already, but it came up over and over again in the book for me, that and I thought back to times in my life where I was like, oh yeah, we thought we were doing really well there, and actually I think there were some things that we got wrong, and
Hmm.
how can we do better?
Totally. And that's okay to get things wrong, right? I think sometimes, I mean, we get in this mindset of like, yeah, I'm a nice person, I'm a good person. I wouldn't do anything sexist or homophobic or racist or whatever it might be. And then we're not open to hearing that feedback. So yeah, I think it's not, it doesn't make us bad people if we have done some of those things, but we want to be humble and willing to learn and accept feedback. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the biggest challenge I got reading the book was not, okay, how can the church as a whole change, but how can I change? What things can I
Mm-hmm.
do
Mm-hmm.
that will make the spaces that I'm in a little bit better,
Yeah.
a little bit more. Because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm a male working in a church role. I'm
Okay.
15 hours a week as a young adults worker, and so with that there comes a certain amount of power, and yet within that,
Mm-hmm.
how do I ensure that that power is used in a way that uplifts everybody in the space, not just those voices that are like mine? Because a lot of my friends are white males, and a lot of them are very intelligent and have lots of good things to say, and so it's really easy just to slip into, oh, that's all we've heard from all year. Um,
Sure.
I know a church that's would claim to be egalitarian, and someone who goes there was telling me that last year they had 2 women preach in the entire year,
Oh
and
gosh.
and both times that a woman preached, a man got up after the sermon to kind of land the plane somehow.
Oh gosh.
And this is in a church that would claim that everybody's equal and that there's no hierarchy and that kind of thing. But it's just those things that we do because that's what we've seen, or that's just kind of what naturally happens, and we haven't thought about it. And I guess where I've come from is actually we need to go further than just saying it's okay. We need to actively work against it.
Totally.
And you hear that with racism as well. Like, you actually need to become anti-racist, not
Right,
just
right.
not racist. And I kind of see the same thing here, where you've got to actively work to try and work against the systems that we've all learnt for so long.
Right, because as you said, it's not just in church, it's kind of the whole society that we find ourselves in, or that has been specifically built for those purposes over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You obviously your focus on the book is patriarchy, like we've been talking about, but you also bring through the book this idea that there's a whole lot of other minority groups that are part of this discussion too. You talk about people of color, queer folk, those with disabilities, all that kind of thing. How has your exploration of patriarchy led you to those spaces, and how did that kind of become part of the conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question and a bit of a complicated one. I mean, I think my first exposure to some kind of serious work and thought around faith and justice was in college through the campus ministry I was a part of. And our faith and justice kind of work there was very focused on race, which was really great for me as a white person because there was a ton I needed to learn, still do, I'm sure. And that was just really eye opening in terms of kind of learning about racism and racial justice and things that I had not had to think about before that. Um, and so I think that that journey almost kind of led me over time into feminism, oddly enough. And I think it took a few years before I kind of realized wait a minute, like these things are not okay in the world of race, right? Like it would not be okay if a church did not allow Black people to preach, for example, or be leaders. And some churches still kind of more subtly do things like that, which is not okay. So I think it kind of took me a minute to realize that it is similarly not okay when churches kind of try to prevent women from doing these things. So I mean, that was kind of the some of the roundabout journey. But I do think that I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking and kind of trying to grow and learn in terms of how do I do this feminism thing in a way that isn't just for white, upper middle class, able bodied, straight women. And I think part of the answer to that is that there are, and as there should be, many people writing about these things. So even as I hope that people read this book, I also hope that they read books by women of color and all sorts of different women and kind of get some of those different voices in there because that's what we need. So yeah, I think my hope is just kind of to not fall into the trap of seeing the category of woman in this very narrow way. So my hope is to be kind of an advocate for and be in community and solidarity with all different kinds of women. So that kind of naturally leads you to intersectionality and how all these things connect.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you were talking in the book about how you as a white woman, you could just be speaking on behalf of all women, and yet you realize that actually
I
your
don't.
experience is not the same as
Yeah.
all women. So you're speaking from your
Right,
own
right.
perspective and from what
Yeah.
that brings, but you're also then going,
Mhm.
well, I need to read more from women of color. I need to
Right,
hear their voices and have that influence the way that I think
right.
about what it is to be a woman in the church. And I
Yeah.
thought that was really beautiful, that I guess you weren't playing a victim card at any point and just trying to go, everything's against me. You're going, no,
Right.
actually, there are some things that I've experienced that highlight some things that we could do better in the church.
Totally.
But there's also
Yeah.
things that I could do better because I haven't heard other voices. And so I'm going to
Hmm.
do that work
Hmm.
as well. And I think that's a real encouragement to
Hmm.
all of us to actually just listen to people who are different from us. Um,
Right.
that we get so narrow when all we do is hear from people that are like us.
Right.
So yeah,
Right.
that was a great encouragement to me in the book, to look outside of ourselves at who could we be listening to. Um,
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I'm always, naively surprised by how much effort that can take, right? And how much kind of some of those white male voices naturally flow into our sphere of reading and listening and all that. And yeah, I mean, I think I write in the book at one point about how I spent one season of Lent specifically not reading any white authors. And I think that was really helpful in terms of kind of jump starting, like, how do I look around more broadly? How do I not fall into this rut? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. You say in the book, I want people of all genders to find and to create the kinds of spaces where women are not reduced to object status, the kinds of spaces where no one is reduced to object status. I think that's a beautiful hope. Um,
Mhm.
from your perspective, what are some of the little things that we can do as individuals? Not everyone who listens to this podcast goes to church, but there are a number who do. So for those of us who do, what are little things that we can do in our church spaces? I say, little or simple things. They might be really hard, because
Sure.
they're awkward for us or whatever. But what are some of those little things that we can start to do to make changes to head towards that hope that you have?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, something that's been really huge is learning how to talk about God in different ways, whether that's just in personal prayer or in church liturgy services, songs. I mean, if your church doesn't mix up pronouns for God in their songs, you can still do that when you sing, just as a personal practice. And yeah, I think that's been really huge and really powerful for me in terms of kind of trying to internalize this idea that God is not a man. Like, we kind of know that at some level. Like, I don't think many people would really say, like, God is a man. And yet, when all the language, all the pronouns we use describe God in that way, then that's kind of the impression you get. So, yeah, I think kind of experimenting with she, they pronouns, or just referring to God as God without a pronoun, I think can be powerful in terms of kind of how women see ourselves as image bearers and how men see women as image bearers equal to them. Um, and I think another thing that comes to mind is just kind of representation in leadership. And yeah, I think kind of making sure that if a church wants to be affirming of women in leadership, that half of their leaders hopefully are women, and kind of women at the kind of higher levels of decision making, and a variety of women that represent different races, ages, all sorts of things within the congregation. I think that's been really huge at the church that I'm a part of now. Yeah, that we don't just kind of say that we're affirming of women. We actually have a female pastor and a lot of female elders. And that really does, I think, change the whole kind of scope of the conversations that we have.
Mm. Yeah, that's awesome. I like that, highlighting the way we look at God, because I think so much of everything else we do in church comes from that.
Yeah.
And like you say, we can be people who are not into patriarchy and yet have never thought about the fact that we view God as a man.
Right.
And yet every way that we can possibly talk about God is a metaphor, because the divine God, whatever you want to call this creative being, is beyond our comprehension.
Right.
And how can you talk about someone like that without metaphor? And yet
Right.
it's so easy to take those metaphors and start thinking them as literal, as fact.
Right.
And yet, not only is God portrayed in many feminine ways throughout the Bible, but also, and you highlight this really well in the book, throughout Christian history.
Hmm.
Um, there's
Yeah.
a lot of white males writing about God as a female, or
Hmm.
having feminine characteristics,
Hmm.
to highlight specific ways that God interacts with us.
Right.
And yeah, for me, that's just a something that might feel really weird if all you've ever known is God as a man.
Totally.
But it is something that is biblical. Like, if people are worried about that, it's in the Bible.
Right.
God's
Right.
God's talked about in feminine ways right throughout the Bible.
Right.
And also it's just way more balanced. And if
Yeah.
that can be a starting point for us to just, yeah, to change some mindsets I think a lot can flow from there. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah.
When does this beautiful book come out, and how can people find it? How can people get in touch with you, find you, follow you, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it comes out on December 1st, so that's exciting. It is available for pre-order now on Amazon and Barnes& and Noble and bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is great because it supports local bookstores. Yeah, and as far as writing in general, I mean, I blog pretty regularly and try to post other articles and stuff at lizcooledgejenkins.com. And I'm also pretty active on Instagram at lizcooledge. So would definitely welcome connecting with everyone there.
I love your Instagram handle. It is so great.
Thank you.
But I had to explain to my kids who LL Cool J was just so they could get the joke.
A little dated, yeah.
But no, beautiful. If you don't know who that is, go look it up, and then you'll get the joke too.
That's why I had to marry my husband with a last name that started with a J, you know. So. Just kidding.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for writing the book. I think it's beautiful. I think it'll be another great addition to the conversation.
Thank you.
I think that it'll be something that women will read and find themselves in there, and find themselves being released into, more of themselves. I think it will be a book that men can read and realize the ways that they subtly participate in systems that they maybe don't even want to be participating in.
Sure.
And I just found it a really hopeful book. You're writing about experiences that have been painful or have caused harm, and yet the whole way through there's this direction of hope going, but we can do something about this. Right. We can live into the fullness of who we are as humans, and we can create spaces where everybody can do that. And so, so that's really beautiful. I love that you finish with a beautiful prayer in the book, which I was going to get you to read, but it's actually quite long. So we'll just wait till people read the book and they can read it.
Yep.
But it is stunning because it brings through
you.
that. It goes through and reminds us of all the things we've talked about in the book, and yet the hope and the joy that can be. So, so thank you for putting it out there. Thank you for all the other work you do around justice, around helping the church be better. Thank you for what you're doing to bring a bit of heaven down to earth.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, for this conversation, and for the work that you're doing.
Hello, hello heaven. Will I hear you whisper to come near?
I got off that video call with Liz, and I have to be honest, a part of me felt like we could have talked in way more depth about some of those things, because this is something I'm really passionate about, and Liz has just thought so well about this and has such great perspectives. But then I realised I'd actually just spent hours and hours reading Liz's upcoming book, in which she does go much deeper, and I just can't fit her whole book in an episode, no matter how hard I try. So hopefully this has been a helpful conversation to listen to, but maybe it's also whet your appetite for Nice Churchy Patriarchy that comes out on December 1st. And I'll throw some links in the show notes for how to find that. It's a great book. It's easy to read, but it's hard-hitting with deep implications for how we do faith and life together. So Liz, thank you for who you are and for what you do. Here is a blessing for you. Liz, as you continue to write about issues of justice and its intersection with faith, may you continue to be spurred on in your calling to help the church be better. May you see small wins add together to become large victories for those whom the church often overlooks, dismisses, or even harms. May your upcoming book get out into the places it needs to be in the world, helping challenge thoughts and structures, encouraging all who read it to live out their faith in a better way in the world. May you hear stories of impact from those who have read it, and so be encouraged. But may you also know that its impact goes way beyond the stories that you hear. May you continue to find and help create spaces that truly empower women and allow you to flourish and live into the fullness of your humanity. May you gain new and exciting opportunities through the release of this book that help extend your reach and allow you to challenge the way our church spaces are designed on a greater scale. May you know rest and peace and joy and love each and every day. And lastly, may you know you are seen, you are heard, and you are loved. Thanks to Strawn for the music and Rangi for the karakia. Join me next time when I talk to business leader, change agent, and people lover Bruce Pilbrow. Bruce is currently the CEO of the Spirit of Adventure Trust, who specialise in youth development. We discuss his varied career through the business and not-for-profit worlds, how each of those spaces has informed the other, the joys and challenges of bringing change to organisations, how empathy is required when moving people's worlds around, and also the way the Spirit of Adventure Trust goes about changing lives and empowering young people to live their lives with passion and purpose. Until then, me inoi tātou.
E tō mātou matua I te rangi, kia tapu tō ingoa, kia tau mai tō rangatiratanga, kia mea te tau e pai ai ki runga ki te whenua, kia rite anō ki tō te rangi. Homai kia mātou ai nei, he taro mā mātou mō tēnei rā. Muro mātou hara, me mātou hoki e muru nei I o te hunga, e hara ana kia mātou. Aua hoki mātou e kawea, kia whakawaia, engari whakaorangi a mātou I te kino. Amen.